So our first speaker is Ana Saez Hidalgo, and she's a member of the University of Valladolid. She's an associate professor of the Department of English Literature, and she has been working very intensely, very deeply in the literature and the cultural manifestations of the exiles among some of her works, and also on material culture of the book, on libraries. She has been doing specific work on the Library of the English College at Valladolid. And today she's going to be presenting her talk on Nuns on the Run, which we're going to be speaking about female exiles of the faith and their itineraries and their roots. So without further introduction, I think I'm going to leave you to enjoy Ana Saez's talk to all of us. Ana?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the Warburg Institute for hosting the seminar, to Berta, obviously, for organizing it, and to the Spanish Research Agency for support through funding for our research project, missions and transmissions, exchanges between Iberia and the British Isles during the long early modern period. We have a just newly renovated website, so for anybody interested, we'll pass the information if you want. Let me see if technology works and I can share my screen. And I'm hoping you can see a black screen here. Just to say before starting that what I'm going to be doing today is a preliminary approach to a topic that I'm starting to explore. So in the Q&As, obviously, I will welcome any questions, comments, suggestions. I'd be very happy to hear from you. In 1519, Winky the Word published The Orchard of Zion, a translation of the Revelations of St. Catherine of Siena. In the prologue, he addressed the nuns of Zion Abbey, inviting them to read the book and, following the gardening metaphor, benefit from its spiritual fruits. Quote, "In this orchard, when you will be comforted, you may walk and see both fruits and herbs. And although be it that some fruits or herbs seem to some sharp, hard, or bitter, yet to purging of the soul, they be speedful and profitable when they be discreetly taken and received by counsel. Therefore, goodly sisters, in this ghostly orchard, as reasonable time ordained, I will that you disport yourselves and walk about where you will with your mind and reason." End of quote. This edition is considered to be a turning point for the nuns' relationship with the world of books and printing. While the prologue makes evident that their learning and reason were undisputed at the time, this edition would be the foundation stone for a long history of publication, both in manuscript and print, that continued for centuries, even through the sharp, hard, and bitter times of the persecution and itinerancy on the continent, in what is widely known as the wanderings of Zion nuns. This is precisely what I intend to examine in my talk today, the itinerant texts for the itinerant community, and more specifically, how their textual dissemination in the Iberian context moved between ephemeral and the permanent, shifting voices and genres. As I'm sure most of you already know, Zion Abbey is a late medieval royal foundation, a dual monastery of religious men and women of the Brigittine order, whose nuns were dedicated to meditation and contemplation. both activities being strongly rooted in reading, communal oral recitation of its rule, constitutions, and chronicles, as well as discussion of the liturgical and devotional works. But as with the other religious communities, the dissolution of monasteries in England really disrupted the routines, much more than that. And although initially their distinguished and highly respected position spared Sion Abbey from more radical measures, they were eventually expelled from the country in 1539. Different from other religious houses, the Sion community did not disperse entirely and was transferred to the Netherlands, the starting point of an itinerancy with innumerable locations and relocations for decades until they got established in Lisbon in 1594. Throughout these 55 years, the community came back to England for a brief period when Mary Tudor restored Catholicism and recalled them in 1557. And in the image, you can see how Philip is presented as receiving them in London, recogidas a Londres. However, little after Elizabeth reinstated Protestantism, the community was exiled to the Low Countries again. And here we have again Philip saying them goodbye, and Philip in the Netherlands receiving them. This entry in the Netherlands happened in 1559. But their hard times did not end with their exile, as while on the continent, they had to move several times from one place to the other as a result of the dangers involved in the wars of religion. And eventually they settled in Rouen in 1580. The French city would be their dwelling place for several years until the instability took them to leave France and finally establish in Lisbon. All through these hardships and this mobility, the connection of the community with books was never entirely disrupted. These illustrations that I have been showing you that somehow look like a cartoon representation of all the itinerancy of the nuns come from a 17th century manuscript that shows their wanderings until their arrival in Lisbon. And it is precisely this kind of text that I'm going to be focusing on today. Not so much the devotional, not so much books providing models for their devout lifestyle, but works about their wanderings, and not this specific manuscript, which is a little bit late for what I'm going to be talking about. What I'm going to be talking about is these texts as disseminated in the Iberian Peninsula in the last years of the 16th century. In 1599, the Spanish hieronymite Diego de Yepes included the story of the Sion nuns in his Historia Particular de la Persecución de Inglaterra, whose title page you can see here, History of the English Persecution. This culminated more than a highly prolific decade of manuscript and print dissemination of news about the hardships of the community in what can probably be considered one of the most widely reprinted stories about English religious persecutions in those years. Researchers like Anne Hutchinson and Betty Travitsky, among others, have highlighted the importance of these texts as they were written directly or indirectly by the protagonists, speaking in their own voice and in the first person, and they are rare records and testimonies of the realities of recusant women. The purpose of my talk is not, however, to examine the details of the story of the Sion nuns, but rather I intend to interrogate these texts' representation of the story of the Sion nuns for a Spanish audience and the process by which they morphed and winnowed the narrative to tailor the information and suit it to the Iberian print culture. The question of how these texts convey the Zion nuns' experience of displacement, strangeness, religious identity, and their often failed acclimatization will prove to be inextricably connected to the information provided in them. Yepes' history of Zion includes two sections: the history of the Abbey since its foundation until their establishment in Lisbon, and a letter by one of the sisters, Elizabeth Saunders, recounting her arrests, imprisonments, and escapes until safely fleeing the country to join the community in Rouen. I'll come back to the letter in a few minutes, but let me start by now with the history in which the nuns are presented as a unique English religious community, highly valued, not only because they had succeeded in the continuity after the dissolution, but also because they maintained the esteem and respect that they had before the schism, being a royal foundation. This particular aspect is especially emphasized at the beginning of the account, presenting its founder, Henry V, as, quote, one of the most illustrious and famous princes that kingdom has had, both in war and in state grandeur, and especially in religion and piety, end of quote. This is actually a signpost that will be picked up later in the account, where the Lancastrian lineage is connected to the Spanish monarch in some kind of genealogical juggling of sorts to appeal for the Habsburg monarch support. That Spanish monarch is no other than Philip II, rather than the one reigning when Yepes published his work, Philip III. The reason for this is that Yepes is actually reprinting an earlier text published by Robert Parsons in 1594. The one you have, whose title page you have on the screen. The relation by the English nuns of Zion Abbey, who were in Rouen, in France, sent to the Jesuit Robert Parsons about their fleeing that city and their arrival in Lisbon, Portugal, translated from English into Spanish by Charles Tankard, English priest of the English College in Valladolid. In it, the title page says, it's discovered the state of things in France once Vendôme, that is Henry IV, was recognized as king. That this relation was published in 1594, the year the nuns arrived in Lisbon, is not innocent. As Christopher Hiley has remarked, by publishing this Zion account, Parsons was building up a joint enterprise, typographically incorporating this newly founded monastery in exile to the English mission in Iberia, already started with the foundation of the Valladolid and Seville English seminaries. The establishment of these colleges was also accompanied by comparable publications that informed Spaniards about the persecution and publicized their plight with an eye on raising funds for the institutions. In that regard, this Zion account shared the same program in Parsons' mind, and actually the official approval to the volume highlights its value as an account of, quote, the big constancy that God gave our religious women to flee from the heretics and find him among Catholic people, end of quote. But what about Yepes? His history of the persecution of Catholics in England is a sizable, lengthy volume collecting as many particular stories of persecution and martyrdom as he could gather from his vantage point as prior of the monastery of El Escorial. Like Parsons, he includes the history of Zion in the section dedicated to the foundation of the English seminaries, quote, jointly founded with the support of the Pope and the Spanish King Philip for the spiritual succor of the English kingdom, end of quote. A statement of the religious political enterprise behind these religious houses. Unlike Parsons, however, he does not incorporate the complete text published in 1594, but rather selects what was originally the preamble to the relation you see on screen. That is the overview of the history of Sion Abbey from its origin until its arrival in Lisbon. What he leaves out, actually, is a highly detailed narrative of the circumstances that impelled the nuns to leave France and move to Lisbon. One wonders what the reasons for such a decision could be when what Parsons published is a first-person account that could be as valuable as many of the martyrdom stories in Yepes's work. But there is more to this omitted section of the narrative than the hardships of travel and the blackmail of ship owners taking advantage of the precarious situation of the nuns. Actually, it is this section that has been omitted is deeply imbued in the geopolitical issues current in 1594. The French Wars of Religion, at the moment when Henry IV, still a Protestant, was approaching the area of one, and the subsequent conflicts of loyalty that this posed to its citizens, including the nuns. Pledging loyalty to a Protestant monarch clashed with their Catholic religious identity, especially because Henry had been excommunicated by the Pope. How deep this would resonate among English Catholics cannot be overstated. And that is certainly why in 1594, Parsons was interested in this material. As Freddy Dominguez points out, quote, France was too close to home and the English threat too palpable, end of quote. By 1599, when Yepes reprinted this text, this situation was no longer current. Henry IV had already converted, and the war between France and Spain was over. Therefore, Yepes omitted what otherwise would have been a very prized first-person testimony of persecution. Instead, he chose to publish a letter by Elizabeth Sanders. By then, by 1599, for many readers, this was one of the most popular first-person accounts of persecution by a woman. And certainly, it comes as no surprise that this letter would make such a splash in the Iberian Peninsula. Actually, it is a text that has continued fascinating readers and scholars alike down to our days. In Gina Leigh's words, it offers, quote, material evidence in a lengthy case against English Protestants, end of quote. But not only does it provide very rich detail of recusant underground activities, as mentioned before, but it also opens a window to a personal experience of persecution and imprisonment in England told by a woman in a very personal voice. The Iberian dissemination of Elizabeth Sanders' story of persecution epitomizes the strategies of information and propaganda implemented and masterminded largely by Robert Parsons. Let me start by giving a bit of background. The sister of the renowned polemicist Nicholas Sanders, Elizabeth, was a Sion Abbey nun sent back to England from the continent in 1578, presumably to escape the perils of the Wars of Religion, possibly to secure funding for Sion, and eventually to collaborate in disruptive activities like the dissemination of copies of Campion's Challenge. This seems to have been the cause of the first of her many arrests and imprisonments. Almost a decade later, she managed to escape and return to her community in Rouen. According to her, it was at this point that Francis Engelfield, a Catholic exile in Madrid and a major donor of the Sion community with whom she had correspondence, asked her to tell him more details about those years. The result of this petition is 2 letters, of which only one remains to our days. One of them is preserved in a manuscript, which is the one you can see a snippet of at the top. And although the original of the second letter no longer exists, it is not entirely lost, as it was printed as part of Robert Parsons' first publication in Spanish, the Relación de algunos martirios, relation of some martyrdoms newly carried out by heretics in England, and other things touching our saintly Catholic religion. Printed in 1590, it is a composite volume with information on the religious persecution, instances of martyrdom, the foundation of the first English college in Valladolid, and Sanders' second letter. It is Parsons' published version of the second letter, not the first one, that was eventually reprinted by Yepes. But not only. It also saw print, though incomplete, twice more. In Pedro de Rivadeneira's second part of the history of the ecclesiastical history of the Schism of England, 1593, this letter was disseminated partially, and it was also printed and dated by volume publication almost entirely dedicated to Sanders' letter. Hence, the dissemination of Sanders' story of persecution, imprisonment, and exit from England followed the same pattern as some of the news distributed by English Catholic networks, while the majority of them were widely distributed in manuscript among colleges and recusant centers for ephemeral updates on the specific situation at that moment back in England. Some of them reached a more permanent form by being printed, normally while still current. And that's one of the puzzling things about Sanders' letter. Elizabeth Sanders' letter did not lose currency throughout the 12 years that lapsed between the moment of writing them and its publication by Yepes. This is largely the result of how the manuscript was transferred to the printed format. From the extant manuscript letter, it is clear that Sanders understood Engelfield's interests in her adventures under the Elizabethan repression of Catholics. These were the earliest times when the underground recusancy was still being organized, and any information passed by someone like Sanders was absolutely precious. She had survived several interrogations and as many as six imprisonments and as many jailbreaks through the years. She had been in touch with other recusant prisoners and gained the trust of the prison officers. Engelfield, understanding the value of her experience, asked her to put it in writing. As a result, her manuscript letter is written in a testimonial, factual style with plenty of details of names of people, questions in the interrogations, how she defended herself, claiming to be harmless for her gender, for instance, the places she went to for shelter, how bribes worked, etc. Thus, despite being presented in a highly personal and vivid manner, this first letter is invested with a very pragmatic character. When put in printed form by Parsons in 1590, the letter didn't lose any of its personal and vivid character. However, there is a significant change in voice and narrative focus. It's not just that most of the names fade out, as they are clearly of less value for a wide Spanish readership. The whole letter is reoriented into something perhaps more palatable, perhaps more instrumental for the interests of the English mission, an emotional testimony of persecution intended to move the Spanish reader's empathy and compassion towards the newly arrived recusants. The change of tone is evident not just in what is omitted, but also in some additions. One of the most significant additions is the story of a Protestant judge who, after having sentenced a recusant and noticing how his wife was crying and yelling, eventually she fainted. And at that point, that situation reminded him of what happened to other Protestant judges who had just condemned a Catholic to have his ear cut. And immediately after the sentence, they all died suddenly. This judge, realizing the comparison, all of a sudden, according to the printed letter, enters in some kind of panic attack, loses his temper, yelling at the crowd in fear of divine retaliation. This is a clear attempt to ridicule the figure of those persecuting, condemning, and executing recusants, which is not unfrequently found in martyrdom accounts by way of poetic justice. By adding and morphing such generic undertones, the letter gets in line with the rest of the texts published in Parsons' 1590 volume. The newly enhanced emotional turn of the letter becomes unmistakable in the printed narrative. And a simple comparison could be illustrative of this. The second time that Sanders escapes from prison, she explains how this happened. Very easy, very simple. She bribed the wife of the castle keeper to let her go. And she describes this moment as follows. I talked with his wife in that behalf and offered her £5 if she would let me escape, but she answered she might not do so. Yet I offered her £5 more. And so for 10, I was free. So upon her words, I prepared myself and to depart down by a rope over the castle wall. And then I went to Mrs. Tichborne's house, and this goes on telling where her new whereabouts are. This is what we hear, what we read in the manuscript. What does the printed letter turn into from this very factual account? You have the Spanish quotation. I'm going to translate most of it. The castle keeper's wife started to favor me, and I communicated with her about my situation to return to the convent, my wish to return to the convent. Showing her the letters that the abbess and the confessor wrote me from time to time made her take pity on me. Well, partly that, and partly the interest in the 40 ducats that I promised her. She agreed to set me free, which she fulfilled, helping me out by releasing me down the castle wall by a rope. Your worship can imagine what would go through my mind that night when I found myself alone, dangling in the air by a rope. And once I had reached the ground, alone and helpless, without any idea of where I was to lay my head, forced to flee through the fields to find safety, etc., etc. The Spanish printed text does not merely expand the original. Its vocabulary enhances the dangers of the situation, the mental anxieties going through Sanders's mind, even her internal doubts and conflicts, as if we were hearing speak to herself. With such an emphasis on sensations and emotions, Sanders's narrative enriches the affective mode of her voice, reaching out for the empathy of readers, a technique similarly habitual in stories focused on the unfairness of persecution and martyrdom of innocent, pious Catholics. Undoubtedly, this heightened emotional turn caught on several years after the letter was originally written, when Rivadeneira reprinted Parsons' version of Sanders' story in his second part of the history of the schism. Time constraints preclude me from a more detailed analysis of the methods used to insert her letter in his version of the Elizabethan persecution, but suffice it to say that the story of Sanders' stay in England, her persecution, is abruptly cut. Guess where? stopping at the rope scene and then omitting in like a sentence or so the rest, saying, and she managed to go back to France. If Rivadeneira is so keen in keeping the dramatic narrative of the rope escape and her anxieties, it can be argued that a similar strategy is used almost a decade after the original letter was written in the 1596-98, probably, bifolio. This summarized Parsons's printed version, keeping the bones of the arrests and escapes and new returns to prison until Sanders is finally safe in France. Thus, the story, newly printed in the typical format of avisos or news pamphlets, is not only devoid of names and other kinds of time-specific references, but it also brings forth the feel of adventure familiar to readers even of Byzantine novels. Every calamity in the form of arrest is followed by a stroke of good luck of the protagonist until the happy denouement ends the account. Sure enough, one of the things that this bifolio does is to omit entirely a coda that Parsons had added to Sanders's letter with more stories of persecution that clearly for the bifolio were of no interest. 12 years after Sanders arrived in Rouen, Yepes published his story of Sion and her letter. His version of the story of the Sion nun's identity, persecution, wanderings, and suffering had become widely known and popular among Iberian readers. Or perhaps one should say among Iberian readerships. The manner in which the different versions of the accounts were morphed, winnowed, and tailored to the circumstances evinces the remarkable malleability of the story, able to suit many purposes and tastes, all kinds of formats and genres. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. That was very, very exciting. We could feel the excitement of Elizabeth Saunders escaping from the perils of persecution. Really, thanks a lot for that presentation. And I'm sure that there will be questions at the end. But for the moment, we are going to move on to our second presentation. We are also within, I'm sure that there are going to be connections between Anna's and Thomas O'Connor's talk. Now, let me introduce Thomas O'Connor to you, to those of you who do not know him. Thomas O'Connor is a professor at the University of National University of Ireland at Maynooth. And he has worked on a number of projects, very important digitalization projects that have to do with the biographies of Catholic religious people, right? Starting with the famous website Clericum, where you can find a number of loads of information about the different members of the different communities from the 16th to the 18th century, I think. At the moment, he's more concentrating on the narratives of conversion, and which is the topic of today's presentation. And he's working on the categorization of these conversion narratives. And today is the title of his presentation. Today is, let me see, because I have it here written somewhere. Oh God. Yes, Choice, Necessity, and Laissez-faire in the conversion narratives of early modern Irish Protestants visitors to Portugal. And so without further talk, I'll leave the ground to Thomas.
Thank you very much, Berta, and thank you to the Warburg Institute for facilitating this seminar, and welcome all guests and listeners to Dublin and to a nice sunny afternoon here. It's good to be with you and to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about the dimension of the impious and pious itineraries that I'm attempting to make some small contribution to. Early modern conversions, as we know from what Anna has already said, were high-risk changes of religious and cultural loyalties. In the image, for instance, of a Martin Luther, Henri IV of France, or Sweden's Queen Christina, and their impious or pious itineraries, depending on your own confessional take, are relatively well documented, and they're important chapters in the great men and great women schools of history. So they're quite public events, and generally they are elite events. Further down the socioeconomic ladder, however, the evidence can be thinner. Their poverty and low literacy levels ruled out personal written confessions, and what did make it onto paper frequently fell foul of archival attrition. However, I'm happy to inform you this evening that there are some archival exceptions, and some of them rich enough in quantity and quality to permit us as historians to form what I hope will be some useful insights into both the experience and the significance of early modern religious conversions in the Hispano-British sphere. And these few archives include those of the Italian and the Iberian Inquisitions. And among this select coterie, the palm of plenty must go to the Portuguese Inquisition. It is this archive that provides the raw material for today's presentation, which takes us some temporal distance from Anna's presentation, but at the same time, I hope, as we may discuss in the second part of today's session, may reveal significant continuities throughout the whole early modern period. So today I'm limiting myself to an examination of impious itineraries for the year of our Lord, 1732. Why 1732? Firstly, because archival accident has provided a dozen Irish conversion accounts for that year, which isn't bad. Conversions, I hasten to add, from Protestantism to Catholicism. So despite ambient views, Ireland, even the south of Ireland, was never a completely Catholic country, as some people think. It's much, much more varied and a little bit more interesting than that. Second, 1732 is a good year because the conversions of that year coincide with a richly informative Irish heresy trial, one that involves, and this adds a little bit of salt to the whole proceeding, a female subject, a woman called Bridget Punch. Thirdly, Punch and 1732 and these 12 conversions are interesting and I think worth a look, because Bridget's trial involves a charge of feigned conversion or pretended conversion, in her case, from Catholicism to Protestantism. And I think this provides a little bit of extra context to the 12 conversion cases, which form the body of today's talk, indicating, I hope, that confessional traffic was never one way. And secondly, that confessional traffic was rarely divorced from the concrete social and economic situations in which converts could find themselves. Now, a few brief words on sources, and I don't mean this in any sort of a condescending way. Some people here know far more about these sources than I do, but it has been my experience that particularly for British historians and Irish historians, these sources, and they're very rich sources for the history of the relationship between Iberia and Britain, they're not very well known. And if they are well known, they're not very well used. So a few brief words on them. The Portuguese Inquisition is housed in the Portuguese National Archive in the Torre do Tombo. And these records pertain overwhelmingly to persons of Portuguese extraction. However, because of Portugal's trading and imperial past, there is abundant material on foreign subjects too, mostly French, Flemish and English. And thanks to their long-established trading links with Portugal, Irish subjects also feature frequently in this documentation. And a great deal of this material is conveniently digitized and available via the Portuguese government's digital portal, which everybody knows, the Digit Archivos PT. Within this Inquisition archive, most of the material we're interested in is found in two archival subsections. Now, the first one is called Procesos, or trials, and in all, 45,000 of these survive. About half of them are available online, and they concern the heresy trials of named individuals. Now, to date, over 100 of these have been identified as pertaining directly to subjects from Ireland, the earliest from the 1560s. And many others, especially those involving English, Dutch, and French subjects, are also of indirect Irish interest. Now, these files are not always complete, and they vary in length, but usually include the original denunciation of the person accused, the oaths taken by participating officials, the interrogation transcripts, which are really interesting, defendant genealogies, because the Inquisition wanted to know where they came from, and of course the Inquisition's sentence. And because it is a pecuniary outfit, you also get some information on what it cost and who paid the cost of the trial. The majority of identified Irish cases pertain to the 18th century, and as already noted, I'm going to take one of these, that of the Cork female, Bridget Punch, who was tried for heresy in Lisbon in 1732. So that's series number one. The second sub-series in the Portuguese Inquisition archive, which is of great interest to us, is one called Reducidos, or the Reduced. And the earliest of these cases comes from the 1640s. Now, this documentation concerns individuals who converted to Catholicism from other Christian religions, and overwhelmingly from Anglicanism, Calvinism, or Lutheranism. And as you know, the Portuguese authorities didn't always distinguish between those three varieties of the Reformation. Reducidos were recorded not as individual files, as in the case of the Processos, but as consecutive entries in ledgers or books, libros, some of which run to several hundred folios. All are rich in biographical information, and to date, about 800 Irish cases have been identified, mostly from the 18th century. And today we look at a dozen or so of these reducidos, as I'd already mentioned, for the year of 1732. Now, can I say, there is no direct evidence linking the dozen or so individuals under examination here today, even though they were all in Lisbon or roundabouts at much the same time. Indeed, given the size and extent of the confessionally divided Irish community in Lisbon at this time, it is quite possible that they didn't know each other at all. And then we have to also consider the fact that the archives we're talking about today are secret archives. Everybody was sworn to secrecy, and the secrecy was generally observed. So they wouldn't have known each other from bumping into each other at the Inquisition, and they wouldn't have known that other people had been there, at least as far as I can make out. Now, for some idea of the scale of the British and Irish communities in Lisbon at this time, in 1732, James O'Hara, who is Lord Tyrawley, an Irish-born British envoy in Lisbon, he estimated the English population in the city was at least 2,000. 2,000, that's in 1732. Now, O'Hara, although he was Irish, held Catholics, whether English or Irish, in particular disdain, and it is quite possible that his estimate may not have been careful enough to include all British subjects, Irish and English, Catholic and Protestant, present in the city at the time. So 2,000 is probably an underestimate. Even with these caveats, it is reasonable to assume that the Irish population alone was significant enough to constitute a permanent community rather than a transient presence. And I think that's an important distinction. Another indication of scale and permanence of the British and Irish populations in Lisbon at this time comes from the records of the Jesuit Church of Saint Roch in Lisbon's Barrio Alto. In 1740, just 8 years after our 1732 dateline, clergy there registered over 500 foreign baptisms for that year alone in the one church. These included nearly 70 Irish baptisms, making them the third largest national group after the Germans, who were very prolific, coming in at 182, and the English coming in at 120. And they were obviously English Catholics, not English Protestants. This is a Jesuit church after all. A decade or so later, in the wake of the earthquake of 1755, which we all know about, we've all read our Voltaire, the Gentleman's Journal estimated that there may have been up to 6 6,000 British subjects in the city, the majority of them Irish Catholics. So that's bigger than most Irish towns at the time, actually. To put this community in some sort of context, the relatively frequent appearance of Irish subjects in the 18th century archives of the Portuguese Inquisition is explained in part by the density of trade links between Ireland and Portugal, and in part by the economic opportunities available to Irish immigrants there, particularly in the 18th century. However, the Irish community had deeper roots. From the middle of the 16th century, Irish merchants, tradesmen, innkeepers and clergy are well documented in Lisbon. They are particularly common after 1560, when substantial numbers of political, religious and economic refugees joined the merchants and the clergy. We all know about that from our general history. Religious links were also very well established. The presence of a shrine to St. Bridget, this is the Irish St. Bridget now, not the Swedish one, there is one at Lumiar in the north of Lisbon, and suggests that Luso-Hibernian links included shared devotional traditions and even pilgrimage routes, as well as the usual mercantile and persecution routes. The 16th and early 17th century Jesuit mission in Ireland was supplied and managed largely through Lisbon. Papal and Spanish military expeditions to Ireland and to England invariably set out from Lisbon. In 1590, a confraternity of St. Patrick and an Irish seminary were established there in the city. It catered for secular clergy and was run by Irish and Portuguese Jesuits, and Irish regular clergy were also present in the city. From the middle of the 17th century, the city hosted a Dominican friary. And it also had a Dominican convent, a convent of Irish religious, about 40 strong, and a very significant presence in Lisbon from the middle of the 17th century. Now, in the 18th century, this Irish presence of clergy and merchants tended to grow in scale, reaching its zenith in the 1740s and the 1750s. This growth coincided with favorable economic circumstances in Portugal. Economic historians among you will know that for the first half of the 18th century, Lisbon prospered thanks to the influx of Brazilian gold, and it proved a mixed blessing. On the one hand, Brazilian gold permitted the country to redress a serious economic balance, trade balance, particularly in dealing with Britain and Ireland, countries which were greatly advantaged, in fact, in a bullying way, by treaties signed between Britain and Portugal in 1642, 1654 and 1703. In the longer term, however, the local Portuguese economy proved unable to take advantage of the boom. Imported gold was quickly exported to pay for imports. In fact, Portuguese gold was the most common currency in Ireland in the 18th century. And the gold left the country to pay for Irish and British textiles and foodstuffs. State efforts to thwart this outflow proved ineffective, but from the 1760s, shipments of Brazilian gold fell off, and the Portuguese administration under Pombal began to impose restrictions on British trade, largely to encourage Portuguese trade and native industry. So numbers fall off at this time, and we'll notice in the longer term, the same thing happens in the Inquisition records. The numbers of Irish begin to fall from the 1760s. Now, that's the general introduction. You'll be glad to hear I'm now going to get to the meat of the talk of today, which is our 12 converts and our heretic, and see what they can tell us, their experience about conversions. Now, from the hundreds of surviving Irish conversion narratives, we're going to look today at a dozen or so involving Irish Protestant converts to Catholicism in the year 1732. They date from a period when the Irish community in Lisbon is growing strongly, and they coincide, as I said already, with a particularly informative heresy trial involving an Irish subject. Now, of the 12 conversion cases, 5 involve females and 7 concerned males. 10 of these had been born and raised as Protestants in Protestant families in Ireland. 2, namely one John Dormer and a woman called Mary Connolly, were baptized Catholics, subsequently became Protestants, and now in 1732 want to be readmitted to the Catholic Church. We do not know the geographical origins of all the converts in Ireland, but the majority appeared to come from the southern Irish province of Munster. And they have a very good rugby team you may have heard of, but they're also in the south of the country and the counties of Waterford, Cork, you may have heard of, and Tipperary. Two, however, hailed from Dublin, and one was from Derry or Londonderry, depending on, again, your tradition, in the far north of Ireland. Most of the intending converts in Lisbon were young and they were single. For the Inquisition, subjects only reached their majority at 25, and by this reckoning, only 4 of our 12 were of age. A man called Henry Musgrave, 39, he was ancient, Mary Dalton, 31, William Walsh, 33, and John Dormer, we've already met him, at 26. The remaining 8 are aged between 13 and 25. So given the relative youth of the majority, it's unsurprising that most of them are unmarried. Only Henry Musgrave and Mary Dalton are wed, he to a woman called Maria Kelly, and she to an infantry sergeant called James Gordon. Significantly, both of them Irish. So the couple probably came to Lisbon rather than coming singly and then picking up the partner there. Occupationally, we can only be sure about Smith, Goward, Tyrrell, and Brooks, who are all sailors, and we'll see that's going to be significant later on, and Welsh, who divided his time between cobbling and seafaring. I didn't think those professions would necessarily go together, but I suppose every ship needs its cobbler too. Where parental occupations are recorded, Mary Dalton's father, we know, was a merchant, Mary Connolly's was a carpenter, John Tyrrell's was a beer merchant, who would have thought? And Anne O'Brien's father was a musician. Now, the fact that 3 of the 12 were accommodated in an institution called the Casa dos Catecúmenos suggests that they arrived in Lisbon without any family contacts, because the Casa was an institution set up in the late 16th century to accommodate and instruct converts from Islam, Judaism, and of course later on from Protestantism. It had equivalents in Cadiz and in Rome. We know that Henry Musgrave and his wife Maria Kelly, for instance, and Mary Dalton, perhaps with her husband James Gordon, and also John Tyrrell, were accommodated there. So they were already accommodated in an institution dedicated to conversion before they came before the Inquisition itself. And a fourth one of these 12, a woman called Margaret McClacken, also appears to have availed of church-based accommodation. In her case, she was in Madeira. She wasn't actually in Lisbon. She's one of our extraterrestrials. She's from the Portuguese territories rather than from the mainland. Now, in all cases, all 12 cases, first contact seems to have been made with a cleric of some sort. That's the impression the documentation gives us. But it is unclear who initiates the contact, the cleric or the person who's going to be converted. Now that's significant, because if we can't tell that, we can't tell really much about the motivation. Did it come from the cleric or did it come from the person converting themselves? The decision to convert was in theory free, but it would be reasonable to assume, I think, that other factors entered the equation. In the case of sailors, and we saw how many sailors were among the 12, one cannot always be sure who took the initiative, particularly if English complaints, English Protestant complaints about the subordination of English Protestant sailors by Portuguese crimps are to be taken seriously. I see furrows, our brows are furrowing. What the hell is a crimp? Crimp is the word I learned recently myself. Crimping is a practice, or was a practice, by which sailors in British service were persuaded or debauched, again, depending on your viewpoint, to leave British service and to enter Portuguese service. Given that skilled marine personnel were scarce, always, and given that the English used the merchant marine to recruit for the Navy, this was not a trivial affair. According to the English envoy O'Hara, whom we have already met, he wrote in 1741 that the crimps operated in cahoots with the Irish Dominican friars. The latter, he claimed, were supported by the Inquisition, because the Inquisition claimed that English sailors in question had declared their intention to convert to Catholicism and therefore could not be returned to their English vessels of origin as per the various treaties which had been signed between England and Portugal. So they were not returned to their English vessels. And the state papers in London for the period make frequent reference to crimping. For instance, a little after our period, in 1756-7, 2 seamen of the vessel the Seahorse were allegedly seduced when ashore by Irish friars into jumping ship and accepting accommodation where? In the Casa dos Catecúmenos, which was an exempt house, and they couldn't be returned from there. I'm sure there is more comprehensive material on this topic in the High Court of Admiralty records in the National Archive in London. I don't know, but I think it will be a very, very useful avenue of research. Now, regarding the education of our 12 converts, what is really surprising is how many of them are literate. 7 out of the 12 signed their confessions, including 3 of the 5 females concerned. One of the remaining females did not sign, but it is clear from her statements to the inquisitors that she could read. While still in her native Cork, this is the woman who could read, the 17-year-old Anne O'Brien said she had read books owned by her sister. Now, this 2/3 literacy rate may not be representative of the entire cohort, the 800 who have been identified, but it's still a fairly high literacy rate for this subset. And I think it indicates that among the Protestants coming to Lisbon from Ireland, there is a higher than average literacy rate pertaining among them. As might be expected for relatively new arrivals in Lisbon, most do not speak Portuguese sufficiently well to respond to the inquisitors directly. So of the 12 examined here, 9 have named interpreters. In 3 cases, there is no named interpreter, suggesting that these people spoke Portuguese and spoke for themselves. One of the 3, however, is a 13-year-old sailor, John Brooks, a very tender age to go to sea. He had already spent a few months with the Franciscans, hardly a sufficient interval to master the language or to speak for himself. Now, in Joan Ireland's case, and she's another one of the 12, it is possible that she mastered Portuguese sufficiently well to speak for herself. She was 23 years of age when she appeared before the Inquisition, had been living in Lisbon for some time before coming before the Inquisition, and from her own testimony, considered herself a parishioner of the Portuguese parish of Os Santos, a statement that suggests a reasonable level of integration into the local Portuguese community. So when we talk about integration of these immigrants coming in, what community are they integrating into? Is it the Portuguese community? Is it the English Catholic community? Is it the Irish Catholic community? Or is it some sort of an amalgam of all of them? In another case, that of Mary Connolly, not only was she literate, but she certainly spoke good Portuguese. She had been in the city for some time, firstly in the house of her grandparents, who seemed to have been already settled in the city. They both died. She was taken in by Protestant neighbours. They insisted that she go to Protestant services. Hence, she had the need to reconvert when she left their house and returned to live with Catholic relatives. With 6 years in Lisbon, even if based in an Anglophone household for 3 of them, Mary probably had sufficient time to learn Portuguese to speak for herself. This suggests that the community she lived in was relatively open to Portuguese culture with a certain level of social integration. Now, no 2 of these, I have to keep an eye on time. Oh gosh, it's nearly time to finish already. No 2 conversion narratives are the same, but they do have some shared characteristics. And the first one I'd like to draw your attention to is that the conversion process in all 12 cases had already begun before the subjects appear at the Inquisition. We know that Henry Musgrave, for instance, had already been boarding at the Colegio dos Catecúmenos, or the Casa dos Catecúmenos in Lisbon. We also know that Mary Dalton and John Tarrell had been as well. Margarita McLachlan's case, we learn, that she left her native Derry for Philadelphia in 1728, turned up in Madeira in 1730, and by the time she came to the attention of the Lisbon Inquisition 2 years later, she was already well advanced in her program of catechesis in Madeira, probably with other Irish subjects, and all of this was formalized into a religious instruction which was delivered, you won't be surprised, by an Irish cleric in Madeira, a man called Hugh Maguire, who was also resident on the island. The conversion of the Cork-born Anne O'Brien commenced informally, we learn, in her native Cork, where she lived with her musician father. There, her sister, who later converted, shared religious books with her. I mentioned that already. And these appear to have put the idea of conversion into her head. On arriving in Lisbon, she decided to take religious instruction. So in every case we see, these people were already well on the way to conversion before they arrived in the presence of the inquisitors. Now, among the 1732 converts, we have two, however, who were cradle Catholics, who subsequently became Protestants and then, in 1732, wanted to be readmitted to the Catholic Church. John Dormer and Mary Connolly are these two. Now, it appears that although Dormer's mother was a Catholic and raised him as a Catholic, this is in Ireland, his father, who was a Protestant, insisted that he attend Protestant services, which he obediently did in Ireland, out of obedience to his father. But all the time, his mother is instructing him in her ancestral religion. His coming to Lisbon then appears to have freed him from his parental obligation and permitted him to return, as he says, to his Catholic practices. And he claimed he always remained a Catholic at heart. Now, Mary Connolly, her journey, her impious or her pious itinerary was a little bit more circuitous. She was reared a Catholic in Ireland, but at 11 years of age, she was brought by her Catholic parents to Lisbon. And they committed her in Lisbon to the care of her grandparents, who were already living in the city. And she lived with them for a few years. As I said earlier, both of them died rather inconveniently, and she was taken in by Protestant neighbours. And obviously, they brought her to Protestant services, which were held, you may know, in the English envoy's house in the city of Lisbon. And in her submission to the Inquisition, because obviously, subsequently, she wanted to be readmitted to the church, she blamed her sojourn with Protestants for 3 years on her youth, on her fear, and it's a nice word, her dependency on the people who were looking after her. That there was a mutuality of care there. And that was those are the factors she uses to explain why it took her so long to seek alternative guardians and to return to the bosom of the Catholic Church. And like Dormer, she claimed to have been a Catholic at heart all the time. Now, all 12 of our subjects were accompanied to the Inquisition by a cleric, apparently the cleric who had originally been approached by the intending convert and had already initiated the program of instruction. It was then the Inquisition's job to decide if the convert's attitude and motivation warranted the completion of their instruction, their absolution from whatever heresy they were guilty of, and admission to the sacraments, which of course meant admission to the community, the Irish Catholic community, and in some cases, the Portuguese Catholic community. The instructing cleric often acted as interpreter for the intending convert in cases where they were not fluent in Portuguese. And as I said earlier, if the individual was younger than 25 years of age, they were judged to be minors, requiring the appointment of a guardian or a curador. And he was usually a different person to the instructing cleric, but not always so. Now, the presence in Lisbon, and I think I have to finish up now because I'm gone over time. The presence of 3 largely English-speaking male religious houses in Lisbon ensured that intending converts rarely experienced problems in sourcing catechists, interpreters, or guardians. The majority of the sample under examination were accompanied by priests from the Irish Dominican house of Corpus Santo. That's the Dominican house situated again, very conveniently in the port area of the city, in a district called Remolares. And infuriatingly, in the case of the Dominicans, the scrivener records their religious names only, making it difficult to identify who they were in real life. But in few cases, we know the family name of the cleric as well as of the person who is converting. The predominance of the Irish Dominicans among the catechists suggests that they were the clergy generally responsible for the pastoral care of the large Irish community in the city and of incoming Irish migrants. So the Dominicans in Lisbon were not in preparation only for the return to the mission in Ireland. They were actually servicing an Irish community in Lisbon itself. And I think this must be, I won't say it's unique, but it's a very unusual circumstance and testimony, I think, to the size of the British and the Irish community in the city at the time. I'm going to finish with this. The issue of the Gentleman's Magazine, which I've already quoted, published directly after the earthquake of 1755 in December of that year, describes Remolares, that's where the Corpo Santo was, as that part of the city close to the river, and I quote, inhabited chiefly by Irish Roman Catholics and seafaring people, of the former of whom it was computed that there were 6,000 in Lisbon, end of quote. The English envoy to Portugal in 1755, one Abraham Castres, reported after the earthquake, so about the same time, that the Lisbon Irish were, and I quote, extremely numerous, particularly of the poorer sort, end of quote, and suffered from the earthquake, the tsunami, and the conflagration disproportionately. Many of them were missing, he said. This is in December 1755, but this did not matter greatly, he says rather heartlessly, because, and I quote, so they were so obscure, these people, as not to be known to any but the Irish friars. To conclude, and I'm sorry I have to cut it short, I didn't get to Bridget Punch and her heresy trial, but I'm over time and my apologies for that. These records, and I've only taken a sample, 12 out of 800, I think they're going to be a very fertile source for understanding a little bit more about the internal life of the British and the Irish community in Lisbon, not just in the 18th century, but also in the 17th and in the 16th. Could I add that if there are 800 Irish cases among the reducidos, going by the algebra I worked out for the processos, where I have 100 Irish cases, the English cases are 10 times more numerous. So that would mean there are nearly 1,000 English processos in the Inquisition records, and there could be several thousand reducidos records as well. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I'm just computing from what I know, extrapolating to the bigger picture. So I think this is a really important archive. For some reason, it hasn't been very used by historians. And I think from our project's point of view, and from the point of view of sharing this with you in the Warburg Institute, I think it could be an occasion to assess how this archive could more fully be integrated into the study of the history of relationships between Britain and Ireland on one side and Portugal and Iberia in general on the other. Guramila Mahagav, thank you very much for your attention, and my apologies for going over the time and for failing to introduce you to Bridget Punch, who is a most interesting character. And happy Bloomsday on Thursday. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, both of you. But Tom, that was a very interesting way of finishing. Certainly archival work. It seems that we are in the 21st century and that everything has been read. Certainly not. And there are tons of things in the more known archives, in the less known archives. I think the Archivo de Torre de Tombo for what I've heard, I've never been there, but yes, it seems to be a super exciting place to look for new material. And certainly this cut you've made of this year, these 12 conversos, right, in the Spanish vocabulary, well, just open so much, right, about the possibilities for even biographical information. And there is men, women, really all different extractions, but you've talked about their economical situation not being mostly very good. So, and the fact that all these questions were put to them and therefore recorded, right? It is, I think, invaluable source of information for everything. I'm going to go back to Anna's talk and ask about Elizabeth Saunders. We've really been introduced to this very interesting personality, a woman that with her own voice wrote her memoir of this adventure. And I think it is very interesting how her voice keeps being edited by the different men that subsequently decide to record and report what she had written in these two letters, one which is lost, one which is not. I know, Anna, that you have already said how it was, what was taken away had to do with her French, the adventure in France and so on. But is there, apart from this big part, is there, apart from political reasons, any other thing that you might think that her later editors, her translators into Spanish decided that was that should be erased for any reasons, for it being too sensational or not well adapted to a Spanish readership, or not too much what would be expected of a woman in these circumstances? I don't know if you have any more to say on this way by which her voice is taken and put forward. How much is it manipulated or not, or just rendered?
Thank you. That's clearly one of the keys. I was trying to show that definitely her text, her letters have been manipulated. The main problem with trying to get a sense of how much, particularly in terms of content, particularly in terms of gender or her gender role, or things like what you are pointing out, things that are not appropriate for a woman or something like that. The main problem with that is that the printed letters, or let me say, the printed letter is the second letter, while the first one was never printed. So the second letter, which is, and I am going to put it in inverted commas because I have my questions, it is the one that got to print. That is the one that I was explaining has many changes since the very beginning, since Parsons published it. So all we can do if we want to look at more factual information is to see how some aspects, like what I was telling you about, information that is not in the original, it is in Parsons, or the other way around. And I try to explain more of it, because it is all the detail. Sometimes it's phenomenal, the list of names of people who participated in the questioning, or all the details of how she, for instance, there are some interesting passages in the manuscript letter in which she's talking about her life in prison, things about how, for instance, she exchanges letters and informations with other prisoners, other Catholic prisoners, or some of the information in that letter is really hilarious. Like when she decides that she's good friends with the jail keeper, so taking advantage of that, she's going out for mass on a Sunday and she's left out of prison to do that. But that kind of information in general, one way or the other, toned one way or the other, appears in both places. What we can detect as more significant in the changes is the data and the tone. But again, and I haven't said this in my presentation because I still need to work a little bit more on it. I have some questions about whether Parsons was making it up and whether this second letter might have been just as many other letters that were published by Parsons saying, a priest in whatever has sent me a letter, and actually that's kind of a pose for publication. So I cannot tell this for certain. And the only question is that there's too much missing to be able to gauge all of that.
Yeah, I think we have proof in other cases that we have the original letter and then the printed so-called letter that in many cases, or in some cases at least, they made things up. Thanks a lot. And we've run out of time. So have a good week and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.